In this video, we'll look at the development of the first slave trade to the New World, which revolved around the first European colony, New Spain. But before I do this, I should note that there's a debate about when the first Africans reached the New World. Some African scholars, as far back as the 1920s, claim that Africans first discovered the New World prior to Columbus. They cited things like similar archaeological evidence, similar linguistics, and they noted the Atlantic currents and so forth. Today, most historians reject this argument. They say the claim may be possible, but African nautical ability, their navigation skills and so forth, really precluded extensive organized settlement in the New World. Regardless, Africans were present in the New World long before the first English, as they came with the Spanish in the 1500s. The first, of course, person to reach the New World on behalf of Spain was Columbus, trying to get to the Far East by going west across the Atlantic. And some claimed that one of Columbus's sailors, Pedro Alonso Nino, was black, but there's not any real evidence of that. But in 1501, regardless, Spain relinquished her ban on Africans in the New World and let black explorers, sailors, and slaves accompany the Spanish expeditions. A number of Africans were with the famous explorers that unlocked the secrets of the New World for the Spanish. In 1530, 30 blacks were with Balboa when he discovered the Pacific Ocean. 5 years later, in 1518, they were with Cortez when he conquered the Aztecs, and one of them planted and harvested the first wheat crop in America. In 1530s, blacks were with Pizarro when he conquered the Incas. Blacks were with Coronado when he was the first explorer to get into what is now the southwest part of the United States. One famous black explorer became known as Little Stephen. His real name was Estevancio in Spanish, who explored parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and the southwest part of the United States today for the Spanish. He planted wooden crosses to mark his way as he'd been converted to Catholicism. Indians killed him, not believing him when he said he was an emissary of the white Spanish. I should add that not only did the Spanish have Africans with them in the New Spain, but as the French settled what was later become Canada, they too had Africans with them. There were a number of Africans that traveled with Jesuit missionaries all the way down to the Mississippi River Valley, way before the English-speaking whites arrived. A French-speaking African was the first person to build a house in what later became the city of Chicago. The Spanish first saw the Native Americans as the best labor source for the New World. Of course, there's a lot of gold in Spanish Central America, and they needed people to work in the mines they were building. Using Native Americans didn't have the cost of catching, buying, and transporting people from Africa for that labor source. Native Americans were right there. But Native American slavery wasn't a permanent solution as a labor source for New Spain because they had great susceptibility to the European diseases. European diseases wiped out many of them, making the cost of Indian slaves really inefficient. Indians' simple economic backgrounds also didn't adequately prepare them for the disciplined regime of a European plantation system. The Africans were more familiar with that from Sao Tome and Principe. The Native Americans could also easily escape, whereas the Africans brought to the New World could not. So the Native Americans were not a permanent solution for the Spanish need for labor. By 1517, many Catholic bishops had become upset at the harsh treatment of the Native American slaves, the number of deaths and so forth, and they began to advocate Africans as a solution to the labor source. That year, 1517, the ban against Spanish having black slaves was lifted. Later, I should note that many of these same bishops regretted their decision when they saw, how bad slavery turned out for the Africans as well. At this time, Portugal still held the dominance in West Africa, so the Spanish never really had a shot at developing their own slave trade to their new Spanish colony. Also, I could add that the Pope had forbidden the Spanish from slave trading in Africa, as he had divided up the lands available to Catholic European nations trying to prevent war between Catholic nations. Anyway, what developed was the Spanish would grant a monopoly of their slave needs trading, the trading to provide their slave needs, to the highest bidder. Sometimes it was the Dutch who bidded the highest, sometimes the French, but usually early on it was the Portuguese, because obviously they had the West African coast. This monopoly that the Spanish would grant of meeting their slave needs, a trade to provide them the slaves, was known as the Assentio. Now, although Portugal was the first nation to have the Assentio and control the slave trade, they never really made the profits possible, and ultimately they ended up losing the Assentio and the slave trade dominance by the late 1500s. The Portuguese government never really granted one company a monopoly, allowing several companies to compete, and some historians believe that slowed development and control. But you could also say that Spain itself was beginning to weaken by the late 1500s, and thus the Assentio meant less. More traders were trying to get a piece of the slave trade business with New Spain by that point. By the early 1600s, the Dutch began to dominate the slave trade. The Dutch, of course, were planting colonies in the New World themselves, and they hoped to employ slaves there. You might be familiar with the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. England was also developing colonies in the early 1600s, but it was a time of tremendous English turmoil, religious turmoil. You might think of the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period in English history, and that sort of precluded that nation from getting involved early in the African slave trade. You could say that the Dutch were also wiser than the earlier Portuguese, because they gave control to one company. It was a clear monopoly. This company was the Dutch West India Company. And Dutch slavers from this company really could be seen in all parts of the American colonies by the middle of the 1600s. By the late 1600s, the Dutch began to weaken as well, and they lost their dominance to the slave trade that they'd enjoyed for decades. You could say that the Dutch had been a bit too aggressive in Africa, and they angered the French, and so the French were giving them a lot of problems. And also, of course, the Dutch lost their New Amsterdam colony to the English in the 1660s. Anyway, by the 1660s, by about that time, all that religious turmoil in England was ending, and England was able to put more time and money into developing their own slave trade. England therefore began to dominate the slave trade by the 1670s. In 1672, the king chartered the Royal African Company, which held a British monopoly on the African slave trade for over a decade. That Royal African Company probably became the most important trading company in the history of the slave trade. The Royal African Company itself, however, began to lose its monopoly in 1698 as mismanagement and new competition from other English slave companies sort of began to erode its profits. The Royal African Company began to give up the slave trade in the 1730s and centered its business more on African gold and ivory trade. Anyway, by the fact that the Royal African Company itself began to weaken didn't mean that the English control and dominance of the West African slave trading business itself began to weaken. By this time, there was tremendous demand for slaves in the English colonies in North America, and so they were providing their own slaves. They're providing slaves to their own colonies. Also, while the Assentio didn't mean as much because the gold had declined from New Spain, England did win the Assentio from the Spanish in the early 1700s, and they had more access to the new Spanish market. By 1760s, English slavers transported more than 10,000 slaves to Spanish Cuba alone. By 1788, two-thirds of all the slaves brought by the English to the New World were sold in foreign New World ports. English plantation owners in the New World objected, of course, to the English traders supplying their foreign competition with slaves, but by this point the slave trade had become just too much an integral part of the overall international trade routes that the English colonies at large depended upon. This international trading route, which involved the slave trade, was part of a very famous trade route that supplied the needs of both the New World colonies and Europe, and it was called the triangular trade. Ships would leave ports in Europe loaded down with trinkets and goods that they could trade in Africa. And they would travel the first route of this triangular business to the west coast of Africa, where they would unload these goods from the ship, and they would use them to bargain with the slave for slaves in Africa. And they would then fill up their ship's hulls with these slaves and food supplies to get the slaves to the New World, and they would then sail in the second part of the triangular trade to the New World. There they would empty their hull of the slaves and pick up the goods, the raw materials that previous slaves had made in the New World, and they would fill their hull with these raw materials and go back to their original ports. And so it was a three-part trip for these ship captains and became known as the famous triangular trade. In reality, as these colonies developed, the trading routes were much more complicated. Often, African slavers would leave Africa and provide slaves to the New World, and then carry the Caribbean raw materials to the English colonies in North America. Now, the colonies in the Caribbean, the Spanish colonies, were often not self-sufficient in food, and so these slavers would then pick up foodstuffs from North American English colonies and return it back to the Spanish colonies to feed the slaves. There was, of course, a lot of direct trade going on between Europe and North America as well. So the triangular trade is famous, but it was a simplistic version of the international trade routes in which the slave business was a part. As England began to dominate the slave trade, it perfected the practice of slave trading, all the ugly techniques and skills that were necessary. The first step was to establish a series of forts along the West African coast, sort of like the Portuguese had earlier done in places like Elmina. The English rather, called them factories, these forts, and these factories, these forts, became the center of the slave operation. The ships on the first part of the triangular trade would arrive laden with goods from England brought to be traded for slaves. Things like cotton textiles, utensils of brass and pewter, or boxes of beans, or guns, or gunpowder, and often liquor, things like whiskey, brandy, or rum. All the stuff that the nearby African rulers would want, be in demand, they would trade with. And so what they would do is they would unload all of these materials and store them in the factories. And while they were doing that, the factories had accumulated foodstuffs from Africa, and they would then be supplying the ships for the second voyage of the triangular trade. The people that lived in the factories were known as factors. And the factors worked hard not only to accumulate the foodstuffs the ships would need in the second part of the triangular trade, but also hard in developing friendly relations with the nearby African rulers. These factors would go to the chief of a nearby tribe and get permission to trade in his claimed domain. They would say, here are some goods that I will give you in exchange for permission to hunt for slaves in your kingdom. And the factor would say, I would not take that king's people, but the people of his enemies. And so the king saw it as a win-win situation. They'd get a lot of trinkets and things that they wanted, but they'd also help get rid of their enemies who were threatening their domain. So when a factor went to a chief to get this permission, offering foodstuffs and things that the ships had brought, the chief would then appoint an assistant to sort of aid the factors. And they called this person the Caboose Ear. The Caboose Ear was, of course, an African that knew the area and the tribe's various enemies. And the Caboose Ear would then lead the factor on a hunt for slaves. And of course, the Caboose Ear could identify Africans who were the chief's enemies, so make sure the factor didn't take the chief's own people. Anyway, the Caboose Ear, of course, would focus the factor's efforts on picking up the worst of the king's enemies. When the Caboose Ear and the Factor had rounded up a fair number of the chief's enemies, they'd bring the slaves, the would-be slaves, to the chief, and they would then negotiate a price for the slaves, offering him again additional trinkets and things that he wanted that had been transported originally with the ship. And the Factor, of course, worked for the same trading company as the ship captains. As soon as the Factor had purchased them from the chief, he would then turn them over to the ship captain for storage and ultimately transport back to the new world. This entire procedure was never easy for the Factors and the traders because it was often tough to ascertain a fair price to be paid to the chief. Often the Africans were shaved or soaked in palm oil that made it difficult to tell their age. The price, of course, varied with age and the condition of the slaves. By the middle of the 1700s, you could often say the average price was about 20 pounds sterling for a healthy young man. So the price had risen tremendously. The chief and the Factors, the price had risen as they negotiated. Often the Caboose Ears didn't have a lot of success, and the ship's traders had to stay with the Factors for often 2, 3, even 4 weeks before the Caboose Ear had rounded up enough slaves to fill the hull of the ship. The other option was to keep moving from one factory to the next, but every time you did that, you needed to get reestablished with the Factors and the Caboose Ears. While the Factors and the Caboose Ears focused on securing the slaves, the ship's traders focused on getting enough supplies for the journey to the New World, as I've said. Most of them were foodstuffs from Africa, things like kidney beans, yams, coconuts, and fruits. I said it was never easy for the Caboose Ears and Factors as they hunted for the chief's enemies to get slaves. Often these enemies were well organized, and you could develop full-fledged wars. And it really it developed into pretty major battles often, as the English provided guns and had played one chief off against the others. The slaves brought to the factories were always chained, and the Factors had learned from experience to take necessary precautions. In any event, when the Factor had enough slaves loaded on the ship and enough foodstuffs, they were ready for the second part of the triangular trade, the infamous Middle Passage, which was an absolute nightmare, just absolutely horrible. In the Middle Passage, overcrowding on the ships was most common. There are records from some of these slave ships that as small as 90 tons, and that meant that they should carry about 150 people, were carrying almost 400 people in addition to the crew and provisions of the ship. The practice of overcrowding became so common that even the British Parliament passed a law specifying that no more than 5 slaves could be carried for every 3 tons of ship. These regulations, however, were never really adequately enforced. Of course, the bottom line was more slaves meant more profits. Thus, virtually no standing or sitting room existed for the slaves on these ships. The slaves were chained by their hands and feet toe to toe, and they were stuffed often in bunks that were 2.5 feet tall. And it kind of reminds me of the Holocaust. And they would be chained there, and if somebody died or had to urinate or defecate, that it would come down between the bunks, and it must just have stunk terribly. They would periodically get the slaves up to exercise them on top of the ship, and they would then water them down with seawater, but a lot of them had been whipped and chained, and there were the cuts, and you can imagine how painful it must have been with the salt water getting into those wounds. When the Africans were brought up and made to dance on the ship deck to give them a bit of exercise and fresh air to keep them alive, and doused with seawater, as I say, often these Africans would try to take their relative freedom they had at that moment and try to jump overboard, commit suicide. And the slave traders actually had to put nets on side of the ship to catch them. The slave traders anticipated a certain percentage of these slaves dying, and they would just dump the bodies overboard. They had calculated that it was better to stuff as many slaves as you could into a ship and just calculate a certain percentage dying. That meant more profits than having fewer slaves on it and a higher survival rate. That meant less profits, and so they just jammed them in there. In any event, overcrowding led to epidemics on board ships. Smallpox was probably the worst, and for the Africans, flux was a problem. It wasn't for the white slave traders who had developed some resistance to it. Often blacks would protest with hunger strikes, which of course exacerbated conditions and made many of the illnesses they faced worse. There are some estimates of the mortality on these ships reaching as high as 50%, which is absolutely horrible, of course. I want to read you a description of an African slave that later learned to read and write, that he'd recorded his sort of memoirs, and he was describing when he arrived at the fort. So, and I quote, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was a sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. When I looked around the ship and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country. I was not long suffered to indulge my grief. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and the crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. But soon to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast and laid me across, I think, a windlass, and tied my feet while the other flogged me severely. One day, when we had a smooth sea and a moderate wind, 2 of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately another quite dejected fellow also followed, and I believe many more would have soon done the same if they'd not been prevented by the ship's crew." Unquote. There's been a long debate in history over just how many Africans the English brought over. We know for sure, for example, that one Liverpool trading company alone brought 303,737 slaves in the 11 years between 1783 and 1794. The peak was undoubtedly the last decade of the 18th century, and there were continual increases up until the end of the 1790s. The most reliable estimate for the entire period, from the middle of the 1450s to when the slave trade ended, about the 1870s, was made in 1969, when an exhaustive search of all the records of the slave traders and slave populations in the New World gave a result of just under 10 million Africans, 9,600,000. Some have said that this was too high, but others say that it was not high enough. Regardless, it is a staggering number of people that were brought out. And keep in mind as well that the impact of just taking almost 10 million people over these centuries had on Africa itself. And the ones that they brought were invariably the strongest, the healthiest of society. So that obviously just destroyed the African societies that were left. Earlier slave traders had focused on the Senegal River Valley up higher in Africa. But the English and the Dutch primarily focused on what had earlier been called the Gold Coast, because there had been gold there. But they took out so many slaves from the Gold Coast that it actually became called the Slave Coast. when they depleted a number of Africans from there, some of the later slave traders went further south and concentrated on the Niger and the Congo River valleys. In any event, this concludes the video on the development of the slave trade in New Spain and the English colonies.